Imagine a world not divided by nations, but by lines on a map, drawn with a ruler by foreign hands. Imagine living on the land of your ancestors, only to wake up one day to a foreign flag above you, foreign laws to obey, and a foreign tongue forced upon your people. For centuries, this was the reality for billions across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Europe called it the Age of Discovery. They wrote it as a story of glory, progress, and civilization. But behind those words lies a different truth, of slavery, of hunger, of violence, of blood spilled on plantations and battlefields. Colonialism was never just about land. It was about control over human lives, about reshaping civilizations, and about leaving scars that remain unhealed even today. Official history often tells the tale of the conquerors, but behind the great explorers, kings, and empires, there were other voices. The enslaved, shipped across oceans, the farmers, forced to labor without pay, the soldiers who resisted even when defeat was certain. This is the dark side of colonialism. This is the story rarely told, the story that shaped our present world. Colonialism, the untold stories. The Age of Conquest. This is the first chapter in the story of colonialism. By the 15th century, the ocean was no longer a barrier. It became a highway to ambition. From the small ports of Lisbon and Seville, ships sailed into the unknown, carrying flags, cannons, and greed. Europe called it the Age of Discovery. But let's be clear, the lands they discovered were not empty. They were homes to kingdoms, cities, villages, and civilizations that had stood for thousands of years. Yet to the Europeans, the world beyond their continent was nothing but blank space on a map, a space waiting to be conquered. The 15th century was a turning point for Europe. After centuries of the Middle Ages, the continent had just emerged from the devastation of the Black Death, which wiped out nearly a third of its population. Wars between kingdoms drained resources, but from this chaos arose a new hunger, the hunger to discover the world beyond. There were three main driving forces: wealth, power, and faith. First, wealth. Spices from Asia were the most valuable commodities. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were not just flavors. They were symbols of status. A small sack could be worth its weight in gold. But the spice trade was dominated by Arab and Indian merchants, who sold them at high prices. Europe wanted a direct route. Second, power. European kingdoms competed fiercely. Spain, Portugal, England, and France knew whoever controlled the trade routes would become the next superpower. Third, faith. Europe had recently fought the Crusades. The zeal to spread Christianity blended with political ambition. For many explorers, conquering new lands was not only trade, it was also a divine mission. And one more factor made it all possible: technology. The compass from China, maps from the Islamic world, and the lightweight yet sturdy caravel ships gave Europeans the confidence to challenge the ocean. From small ports along the Atlantic coast, a great ambition was born, an ambition that would shake the world. They did not know what awaited beyond the horizon, but they knew one thing: the world would never be the same. If there was one nation that first paved the way for modern colonialism, it was Portugal. This small kingdom on the western edge of Europe seemed insignificant at first, but in the 15th century, Portugal had one advantage: the sea. Facing the Atlantic Ocean, its people lived from fishing, seafaring, and trade. From this grew a mentality unafraid of the waves. The key figure was Prince Henry the Navigator. Although he rarely sailed himself, Henry established a center of navigation in Sagres, Portugal. There he gathered scientists, map makers, and sailors from across the world. From this hub came the caravel, light, fast ships capable of crossing the open ocean. With these ships, the Portuguese began exploring the coast of Africa. At first they sought gold and ivory, but soon they found another darker commodity: human beings. Along the West African coast, the Portuguese began buying and kidnapping locals to be sold as slaves. They did not yet realize that this small step would ignite one of history's greatest tragedies: the Atlantic slave trade. But for Portugal, Africa was only the beginning. Their true ambition was Asia, the land of spices. Expedition after expedition sailed east. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India by rounding the Cape of Good Hope. His journey opened the first direct sea route between Europe and Asia. This route would change the world forever. After India, the Portuguese turned to Southeast Asia. They arrived in Malacca, then the greatest trading hub of the region. Malacca was cosmopolitan, a meeting point for merchants from Arabia, India, China, and the Malay archipelago. But in 1511, everything changed. A Portuguese general, Afonso de Albuquerque, attacked and captured Malacca with the power of cannons. Within days, the city fell. Traders were expelled, cultures disrupted, and the trade routes now lay in Portuguese hands. For Southeast Asia, the fall of Malacca marked the beginning of colonial rule. For Portugal, it was a golden gateway to glory. From Malacca, they pressed on to the Moluccas, the Spice Islands. Yet Portuguese power did not last long. Their ruthless tactics, forcing monopolies, burning ships, executing rivals, bred hatred. Local traders, Asian kingdoms, and rival Europeans soon rose against them. But one thing was certain: Portugal had opened the door, and through that door, wave after wave of European powers would enter, carrying colonialism to an even wider and more brutal scale. If Portugal opened the way to Asia, Spain opened the door to an entirely new continent, the Americas. It all began with a sailor from Genoa, Italy, named Christopher Columbus. Driven by ambition, but guided by flawed geography, Columbus set sail westward in 1492, seeking a sea route to Asia. He never reached Asia. Instead, he stumbled upon something far more shocking: a land unknown to Europeans. Believing he had reached India, Columbus called the native inhabitants Indios. In reality, he had unlocked the path to Spanish colonization of the New World. At first, Europe reacted with confusion. Was this Asia or something entirely new? That question was quickly answered as Spain sent more expeditions. They discovered gold, silver, and resources beyond imagination. From then on, the Americas became the new stage of imperial ambition. Spain did not come to trade, they came to conquer. The most infamous figure was Hernán Cortés in Mexico. In 1519, Cortés landed with only a few hundred men. Yet he forged alliances with local tribes resentful of the mighty Aztec Empire. With combined forces, he marched on Tenochtitlan, the grand Aztec capital. The battle was brutal. European steel, horses, and firearms gave Spain an advantage. But the deadliest weapon was invisible: smallpox, a disease carried by Europeans, which wiped out millions of natives. Within a few years, the Aztec Empire collapsed, and Mexico fell under Spanish rule. Meanwhile, in South America, a similar story unfolded. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro confronted the Inca Empire in Peru. With just 180 men, he captured Emperor Atahualpa through deception. Leaderless, the Incas fell, and Spain seized the wealth of the Andes, overflowing with gold and silver. The plunder from the Americas was staggering. Ship after ship sailed across the Atlantic, laden with treasure, making Spain the wealthiest power in Europe. But this wealth came at a terrible cost. Millions of indigenous lives were lost, their cultures shattered, their societies forever transformed. Beyond riches, Spain sought souls. The Catholic Church played a central role in colonization. Natives were forced into Christianity, temples destroyed, and ancient traditions suppressed. For Spain, conquest was not only economic, but also religious. Yet Spain's dominance would not go unchallenged. Other European powers, England, France, the Netherlands, soon joined the race for the New World. But Spain had set the stage for one of the most dramatic chapters in colonial history: discovery, conquest, and tragedy in the Americas. After Portugal and Spain paved the way, other European powers refused to stay behind. One of the most ambitious was the Netherlands. The Dutch were not a mighty kingdom with endless armies. They were a small republic born out of a long struggle against Spanish rule. But precisely because of this, they grew into a resilient, disciplined nation, masters of trade and navigation. The strength of the Dutch lay in their merchant fleet. By the 17th century, they commanded the largest navy in the world. Their ships carried not just goods, but the weight of their economic power. Unlike Spain, they did not initially come as conquerors. They came as traders. In 1602, they established the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, or the Dutch East India Company. This was no ordinary company. The VOC was the world's first multinational corporation, granted extraordinary powers to mint money, sign treaties, even wage war in the name of the Netherlands. In essence, the VOC was a state disguised as a company. Its mission was clear: dominate the spice trade in Asia, especially in the Indonesian archipelago. Spices like cloves, nutmeg, and pepper were worth fortunes in Europe. A single shipload could pay off an entire expedition and more. At first, the Dutch appeared as traders competing with the Portuguese, but gradually they transformed into rulers. With cunning strategies, they pitted local kingdoms against one another, signed binding treaties, and did not hesitate to use brutal force when resisted. The most infamous example was in the Moluccas. To secure their monopoly on nutmeg, the VOC carried out the 1621 Banda massacre. Thousands of islanders were killed or enslaved simply for refusing to submit. This tragedy stands as one of the darkest stains in colonial history. The Dutch also built formidable forts in key ports. Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, became the VOC's Asian headquarters. From there, they controlled trade routes, collected taxes, and enforced monopolies. Yet Dutch power was not only about weapons. They excelled in diplomacy too. Many local rulers preferred alliances with the Dutch rather than facing their cannons. These treaties, however, often stripped kingdoms of sovereignty piece by piece. Despite their dominance, the VOC eventually collapsed under its own weight. Corruption, costly wars, and competition weakened it. In 1799, the VOC was dissolved and its assets taken over by the Dutch crown. Thus, colonial rule shifted from company to state. The Netherlands may have been small in Europe, but in Asia, especially in Indonesia, they built a colonial legacy that lasted for nearly 3 centuries. From the 17th to the 20th century, Dutch rule left an imprint that reshaped Indonesia forever.
In 1942, Britain's empire in the Far Asian. Their new Prime Minister,
If the trade of human beings was the fuel, then plantations were the engine that kept colonialism running. From the 16th to the 19th century, plantations became the very symbol of power and wealth. From the Caribbean, Brazil, and the American South to Southeast Asia, plantations of sugar, cotton, tobacco, coffee, and tea stood as the pillars of colonial economies. But behind the grandeur of European palaces built on these profits, there was endless suffering in the colonies. Colonial plantations were not ordinary workplaces. They were systems designed to extract the maximum amount of labor. Millions of enslaved Africans, indigenous laborers forced into servitude, and later contract workers from Asia, toiled from dawn to dusk. They were made not only to plant, but also to harvest, process, and transport crops under constant surveillance and brutal punishment. Every drop of sweet sugar in Europe was born from the sweat and blood of enslaved people in the Caribbean. Every piece of fine cotton cloth in London's markets came from the unpaid labor of workers in the plantations of the American South. And every warm cup of coffee or tea on a European noble's table symbolized the suffering of thousands of farmers in Java, India, and Ceylon. Plantations were also landscapes of violence. Whipping, forced labor under the scorching sun, and deaths from exhaustion or disease were part of daily life. For landlords and colonial rulers, human beings were nothing more than tools of production, easily replaced when sick or dead. This was the true face of the colonial money machine. Plantations did not just create profit, they created vast inequality between Europe and its colonies. The wealth concentrated in Europe meant deeper poverty in the lands they ruled. Colonial plantations stand as undeniable proof that behind the lofty words of civilization and progress lay a brutal system that placed profit above human life. If slavery and plantations were the face of colonialism in Africa and the Americas, then in Asia, exploitation took on a different form, more subtle, yet equally ruthless. Asia was not only a continent rich in land and natural resources, but also home to ancient civilizations: India, China, the Malay Archipelago, Indochina, and Japan. For Europe, Asia was not just a source of raw materials, but also a massive market waiting to be controlled. Their exploitation of Asia was often disguised with pleasant words: trade, treaties, or civilizing missions. But behind this veneer lay a story of coercion, manipulation, and the destruction of sovereignty. In India, the British East India Company slowly tightened its grip. At first, they were mere traders of spices and textiles, but with military and political might, they conquered kingdom after kingdom. India became an economic engine. Cotton was grown on a massive scale to feed Britain's textile industry, while Indians were forced to buy imported fabrics. The result was the collapse of India's local weaving industry and the impoverishment of millions. In the Indonesian archipelago, the Dutch, first through the VOC, then through the colonial government, imposed monopolies and forced cultivation systems. People were compelled to grow coffee, sugar, or indigo, not for themselves but for export to Europe. The Dutch reaped enormous profits, while famine struck Javanese villagers as rice fields were replaced with cash crops. Elsewhere in Southeast Asia, the French entrenched their rule in Indochina, exploiting rice, rubber, and minerals. Vietnamese farmers toiled in the fields, but the best harvests were shipped to France. The natural wealth of Indochina fueled European factories, while the local people remained trapped in poverty. Exploitation in Asia was also cultural. Colonial powers imposed their languages, education systems, and legal codes. The youth of Asia were not educated to build their own nations, but to serve as obedient clerks and officials for the colonial administration. This was the face of colonialism in Asia, not always with chains and whips, but with laws, contracts, taxes, and systems that gradually stripped away rights. Power was wielded not only by the sword, but also by the pen, and often the pen proved sharper than any weapon. The exploitation of Asia shows that colonialism was never just about military conquest. It was an all-encompassing system, economic, political, cultural, even psychological. And its effects are still felt today, as many Asian nations continue to rebuild the independence that was stolen from them for centuries. Colonialism did not merely change the face of the lands it conquered. It gave birth to something much larger, a global economic system. For the first time in human history, before the 15th century, world trade was limited to certain land and sea routes, the Silk Road connecting China to Europe, or the spice routes dominated by Arab and Indian merchants. But European colonialism linked nearly the entire globe into a single network, a network built from blood and tears. Imagine this chain. In Africa, millions were captured, sold, and forced across the Atlantic. In the Americas, they became laborers on sugar, cotton, and tobacco plantations. The harvests were shipped to Europe and transformed into finished goods. From Europe, these goods were exported back to Africa and Asia, sold at high prices. This was the triangular economy, but its impact was far greater. It created global inequalities that still shape our world today. Europe became the hub of wealth. Cities like London, Amsterdam, and Lisbon thrived with banks, ports, and factories powered by the resources of their colonies. Modern institutions were born out of this system: insurance companies, merchant banks, and stock exchanges. Meanwhile, colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Americas were locked into dependency. They were forced to supply cheap raw materials and serve as captive markets for expensive manufactured goods. Infrastructure, roads, ports, railways, was often built not for the benefit of local people, but to funnel resources more efficiently to colonial ships. More than economics, this system shaped worldviews. The West was portrayed as the center of progress, while colonized peoples were branded as backward and dependent. This narrative was deliberately sustained so colonial dominance would appear natural. But behind trade figures and growth charts lies a harsher reality. Millions of lives lost, cultures destroyed, and generations condemned to poverty by an unjust system. This is the rarely told legacy of colonialism. The modern world we know today, with its global markets, multinational corporations, and capitalism, was built upon foundations of blood and tears. Colonialism was built on power, weapons, and fear, but history also records something just as important: resistance. In every continent, in every colony, there were always voices that refused to bow. These acts of resistance lit the spark of change, though often paid with suffering and blood. Resistance in Africa. In Africa, European conquest was never smooth. Great kingdoms like the Ashanti, the Zulu, and Ethiopia dared to challenge colonial might. In Ethiopia, for example, Emperor Menelik II defeated Italy at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. This victory was not only military, it was a symbol that black nations could stand against European colonialism. Resistance in the Americas. In the Americas, resistance took many forms. In Haiti, at the end of the 18th century, enslaved people rose against their French masters. Led by Toussaint Louverture, they won independence and founded the first black republic in the world in 1804. This revolt shook the colonial order. If slaves could win freedom in Haiti, then rebellion haunted every plantation across the Caribbean and the Americas. Resistance in Asia. In Asia, peoples also fought back. In Indonesia, the population rose repeatedly against Dutch rule, from Diponegoro's war in Java to the long resistance of the Acehnese. In India, the 1857 rebellion marked a turning point. Indian soldiers serving under the British rose up after colonial policies insulted their beliefs. Though crushed, the revolt sparked the beginnings of a national movement that would later demand independence. Seeds of change. These resistances were often defeated in the short term. Colonial weapons were more advanced, their logistics stronger, their strategies better organized. But each revolt planted seeds, the awareness that colonialism could be challenged, that freedom was worth fighting for. Gradually, new ideas began to take root: nationalism, equality, and human rights. Ironically, many of these ideas came from Europe itself, born from the French Revolution and the Enlightenment, yet turned into weapons by colonized peoples against colonial rule. Colonialism might have seemed eternal in those centuries, but the flames of resistance that kept burning signaled that change had already begun, and that change, sooner or later, would shake the very foundations of empire.